Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this first event in Bright Blue's new series, Looking Ahead to COP, presented in partnership with the John Leming Foundation. My name is Andrew Leming and I'm an energy and environment researcher with Bright Blue. This event will be focused on nature-based solutions to climate change. In recent years, awareness of the potential for nature-based solutions to help with addressing the climate emergency has increased. Nature-based solutions involve conserving, managing, and restoring ecosystems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide adaptation and resilience gains, helping us to tackle the twin challenges of the climate and biodiversity crises. In looking ahead to COP26 and COP15, our discussion here today will consider how nature-based solutions, both in the UK and globally, can play a role in addressing climate change. Some of the key questions that we will discuss include what role can afforestation and other rewilding efforts play in reaching net zero? What are the potential challenges to scaling nature-based solutions globally? How can we ensure that environmental restoration is associated with a positive effect on biodiversity? And how can the private sector be involved in supporting the rollout of nature-based solutions? Here to discuss these questions with us today are Tony Juniper, who's the chair of Natural England, Minette, the president of the National Farmers Union, Craig Bennet, the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, and Kaya Axelsson, Net Zero Policy Engagement Fellow at the Environment Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind the audience that you can submit questions using the Slido event link located below the video or tweeting on Twitter with the hashtag #BrightBlue. The speakers will have 5 minutes to lay out their ideas regarding nature-based solutions, and then we'll proceed to audience questions afterward. So Tony, I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. I guess my opening thought in relation to how we can best advance the idea of nature-based solutions at the two COPs this year, it kind of relates back to the fact that we have been negotiating through these two conventions since 1992 and the Earth Summit, when the world agreed to set up these two international agreements, one to conserve biodiversity and one to deal with climate change. And the fact that we find ourselves now getting on for 30 years later in a far worse position than we were back then in terms of global concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and ecosystem damage globally, I think it does beg the question as to, what have we not been getting right? And my experience from many of these meetings over many years tells me that one of the things we might want to focus on is what is deemed as the national interest for countries that are turning up to these meetings, because negotiations are just that. It's about countries seeking to find an agreement, but based very much on their national interest and the perceived health of their country, its economy, and the long-term interests of different industries that it has. And to that extent, I do think we need to build a case for nature-based solutions, which is very much about advancing national interests rather than perceiving to cut across them. And so in this country at the moment, we are, for example, dealing with the early impacts of climate change seen in relation to flooding. And we know that one thing we can do to combat that is to restore ecosystems, very much in the interests of the population, at the same time as helping us to remove carbon from the atmosphere, at the same time as being a boost to biodiversity. So multiple wins out of a solution which is linked with those big problems, but which is very much about protecting the interests of the people and of the country. Looking at some of the tropical nations like Brazil, for example, which has been embarked on still very high level deforestation in the belief that this is good for the country's economy. When you start to look at the extent to which the rainforests, and there is a clue in the name, are actually developing the rain, which is leading to most of the country's agricultural exports being sustained, at the same time as being the source of 80% of the country's hydropower, I think you've got a completely different take on it, where nature and nature-based solutions are not cutting across economic development and security. They're actually the means to secure economic development and security. And I do think this is going to be very important for this year, for these two COPs, to be representing the environmental idea as not one which is against economic or social goals, but which is very much the vehicle that can achieve economic and social goals. And that is really quite a shift in the storyline. And I would encourage the UK, and I do encourage the UK actually, to be thinking very much about how we can show leadership on this in the period running up to the COPs, to show that you can do nature recovery, you can do low carbon at the same time as having healthier conditions for people, sustainable and secure food, sustainable and secure water, and adaptation to some of these changes that are now coming towards us. And so I think really, for me, it's about the storyline. If we can land the idea that this is in the national interest of countries everywhere to embrace nature-based solutions as a means of dealing with both the climate change and nature emergencies, I think that would be a very good way to reposition the conversation. And we can show a lot of leadership here at home in the UK, and indeed we are doing through the new policy and legal platforms that we're building.
Great. Tony, just as a quick follow-up to that excellent presentation, I mean, when it comes to the COP, obviously the goal is to try to find the cross-cutting interest across parties. In this case, it reminds me of what Sir Dieter Helm has written about net zero and the focus on, you know, an individual country's goals as being kind of the vehicle for driving that change and addressing climate destruction generally. I mean, how would you propose going about a solution which takes into account the individual country's interest at the COP and is focused on that level? Do you think the framework is inadequate for dealing with that?
Well, it is a multilateral process, and so it's involving 198 members of the United Nations or whatever it is. And so in the end, it does have to be an accommodation between the global emergency and what countries are willing to sign up to. One thing I would reflect on actually in relation to that apparent disconnect between the global and the national interest is what happened in Paris in 2015, because that was a breakthrough time when, after many, many years of seeking to come up with an international agreement based upon all countries agreeing everybody else's targets, we actually adopted a different approach whereby the common threat of climate change was recognized, but then the idea of nationally determined contributions was negotiated as the means to be able to go towards the global outcome through countries being able to adopt strategies and plans which were of their own making rather than something which had to be painfully agreed with every other country in the world. And so it might well be that we can find something comparable on the biodiversity side, where we can see the global mass extinction as something which everybody should be concerned about, but then building the means to deal with that through national strategies and plans, which really do reflect the national interest in terms of social and economic goals. And I think that formula could be something that would be very productive, because it is working to an extent on climate change. And actually, the UK was a real leader in Paris in being able to show that it was possible to come up with a national framework, because we already had one, which we'd agreed in the Climate Change Act of 2008. So doing something similar with nature and putting that with our net zero plans this year to come up with something that is the integrated strategy to do low carbon, high biodiversity as part of a nationally economically rational plan, I think is the sweet spot.
Thank you for that. Minette, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Andrew, thanks so much, and a very good afternoon to everyone. And a great opportunity for me, representing 50,000 farming businesses across England and Wales, to really give, I guess, my thoughts on not only nature-based solutions, but also the journey to carbon neutral, the journey to net zero. In our eyes, hopefully by 2040, we can't effectively get there soon enough, and in the government's eyes by 2050. But ultimately, we are the first country in the G7 with the Climate Change Act to have legislated on that journey. And I don't believe that there is a get out of jail card on this one. We have to do it, we have to commit to it, and no government will be allowed to step back from that. But as we all know, with climate change, it's got to be a whole approach. And I think the points that Tony made around Paris are absolutely key. And this year, not just with the COP, but with the G7 summit in June and with the UN Food Summit in September, it marks the start of a very, very pivotal time for the UK as a global leader in this arena. And obviously what I am very focused on, and what I have been very keen to pitch farmers as the solution on, is, I guess, our near unique ability as farmers on farmland to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we are a source of emissions. Currently in the UK, 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture. But the really exciting thing is that we can do something about it. And in doing something about it, we can really, I believe, lead the global charge for actually how we lay out an international framework to get to carbon neutral food production. Because what I would say is, as far as the environment goes, as far as the biodiversity crisis goes, none of this is going to change unless we change the way that we produce our food, and to a certain extent, the way that we change the way we live our lives. And this is where agriculture can offer so many of the answers to the challenges that we face. And our dependency on total man-made fibers is unsustainable. So not just the food that we eat, but the way we live our lives. And to keep depleting the world's inner finite resources, we need to be able to grow things in an ever more sustainable way on the earth. So nature-based solutions is one of the three key planks, if you like, in what we believe is the journey to net zero. So being able to grow more trees, to be able to have more hedges, to be able to lock down and store more carbon is absolutely essential. But also in all of this is the need to be focusing on on-farm efficiencies. Now, what do I mean by that? That horrendous word efficiencies always conjures up the sort of worst thoughts, I think. What I mean is to decrease the food production footprint. So this is where technology, innovation, changing world of R&D is going to drive, I believe, more change in the next 10 years than we have witnessed in our lifetimes to date about how we produce our food. And that is ultimately about producing food with less inputs, whether it's less fertilizers, less chemicals, but decreasing that food production footprint. And then thirdly, it is about boosting production of land-based renewable energy. And that includes bioenergy, which is coupled with nature-based solutions of carbon capture, but generates offsets through greenhouse gas emissions. Can be avoided and actually removed as well. So I guess just in conclusion, what I would say is nature-based solutions absolutely must be verifiable. I speak to a lot of people who just think talking about nature-based solutions is just stepping back and leaving nature alone. It is absolutely not about stepping back and leaving it alone. We have to help nature every inch of the way. So it's got to be verifiable, additional and permanent, or at least long-lived over decades. You cannot just think, we'll have a play around in this area for 2 or 3 years and see what happens. It's got to be long-term. There are opportunities, of course, for soil carbon storage, and they may be unevenly distributed across farm types and harder to verify. But we mustn't allow that, I believe, to stop us agreeing the principles on a whole chain approach. That is absolutely essential. And giving farmers, I guess, access to robust carbon offset is a key policy ask to enable nature-based carbon storage. And we believe that rewarding carbon storage can be a foundation for layering with additional incentives for environmental benefits like biodiversity and managing diffuse pollution. So enormous opportunity in this area, but you have to look at the other areas as well, and you have to take a global approach. The biggest mistake that we will make, and it's one of the 4 points in here, is we think that we can go it alone. We have to take everybody with us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Minette. And there are a lot of questions coming in on Slido. Keep submitting them. A lot of them addressing agriculture. So we'll come back to your points in the question and answer session for sure. Craig, would you like to go ahead? 5 minutes.
Thanks, Andrew, very much. And I'm very pleased here to represent the Wildlife Trust's 46 local wildlife trusts across the UK. Collectively, just to give you a couple of statistics, we run more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK, 1,000 more. And we estimate that 60% of the British population live within a 3-mile walk or cycle ride around nature reserves. So we really understand that connection between people and nature. And it's worth saying right from the top, of course, we often hear that phrase, we're living in a climate and ecological emergency. And it's worth emphasizing from the top just how those are inextricably linked. If anyone really needs to deeply understand how they're linked, just look at the natural history of the Earth over hundreds of millions of years. If you look at the way the climate has changed naturally in the past, as we've moved from ice ages into warm periods, a lot of those shifts have started off by little wobbles in the Earth's rotation, the Milankovitch cycles if you're interested, but that's not nearly enough to explain the changes. The only way you can really then make sense of the big changes in temperature that go from an ice age to a warm period is when you factor in the flux of carbon that's gone from the atmosphere to the biosphere and back again. And we shouldn't be surprised in this, really, should we? We're always talking about fossil fuels. The clue's in the name. The problem is caused by human-caused climate change is caused by burning dead biodiversity from many millennia past. So the clue is really there that the climate emergency and the ecological emergency are linked. Now, we often hear this phrase about the need to get to net zero, and of course we need to do that as soon as we possibly can. But we sometimes overlook the fact that the science is actually also really clear that we need to go beyond net zero to net negative in the second half of this century. And actually that really points more than anything perhaps to the role for nature-based solutions, because unless we somehow invent some huge machines that can suck carbon out the air and do that at scale, and I'm doubtful that that will happen, and surely anyway, even if we did, wouldn't it be better to use the machine that's been there for millions of years that has done it for free, which is known as nature? So I highlight all those because it all means that the sooner we can really scale up nature-based solutions to climate as at scale, the sooner the better, absolutely. But also, actually, we've got to be careful to make sure that that doesn't get in the way of or isn't seen as an alternative to cutting emissions at source. We need to do both. We need to be doing everything we possibly can to cut emissions, fossil fuel emissions at source, and we need to be scaling up nature-based solutions at scale as much as possible, which raises a real question about the role of offsets, for example. Offsets need to be used for the really hard to mitigate sectors in society, but we don't necessarily want to be using them for the easiest sectors. We need to really cut emissions at source and then have nature-based solutions for the hard to reach sectors, and indeed for going net negative as soon as we possibly can. When we talk about nature-based solutions, there's a lot of focus on trees, and of course there is a big role for trees in what they can do here to suck carbon out the air. A lot of focus is often put on tree planting, but we would say there needs to be a much greater focus on natural regeneration. And actually you can get a good mix of hybrid, if you like, half and half, where you plant some trees to offer the seed dispersal to allow a lot more natural regeneration. But many other forms of nature-based solutions don't get nearly enough attention. In the UK, our peatlands, for example, are incredibly important carbon stores, storing around 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon. They are the UK's tropical rainforest, if you like, but over 80% of them are in poor condition and degraded, so they're actually releasing carbon into the air rather than sucking it out the air. Our wetlands, our grasslands, our salt marshes, all very important as well. Our seagrasses, a hectare of seagrass may store 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year and hold it for centuries, while of course also providing a natural habitat for young fish. And that points to the fact that there's also biomass carbon. In other words, if we can restore the abundance of biodiversity, not least fish, insects as well, then all that is actually locking carbon up in the biosphere rather than the atmosphere. So there's a lot to do and a huge potential here. At the Wildlife Trust, we estimate that actually fully restoring our natural systems in the UK could provide around 37% of the CO2 mitigation needed of today's emissions if we got serious about this. And if we're cutting emissions, really working hard to cut emissions at source, then nature-based solutions can become an ever bigger part of the way in which we let nature help tackle the climate crisis. Just a final thought on private sector finance. Of course, the more we can create incentives for private sector finance to be a multiplier effect to public sector finance in this area, the better, because we've got to really deliver this at scale. I think the way to do that is we do need some new policy thinking about how we can make sure that all the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions that go beyond just carbon, but to soil carbon, to flood alleviation, to so many of the other benefits that come hand in hand with nature-based solutions. If we can incentivize those, then that's going to be good for the climate, good for nature, and ultimately good for the economy as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Craig. We've got quite a few questions coming in on Slido. I just remind the audience you can submit there or on Twitter using the hashtag #BrightBlue. Kaya, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been such a great discussion so far, so I'm just going to pick up on a few points. Minette, you're so absolutely right that farmers have such a key role to play at Oxford Net Zero. We have worked quite a lot with farmers, and we're very happy to continue to do so. You know, in particular, thinking about soil uptake and something as simple as, you know, hedgerows and the biodiversity. I think I wanted to mention one important thing that we look at, which is, you know, we have scientists who are thinking about atmospheric lifespans, and you know, just like you said, permanence is such an important question so that we don't kick the problem of climate change into future generations. If we are guaranteeing that a nature-based solution has a 12 to 15-year lifespan, that might be appropriate to offset methane, for example, which has a 12 to 15-year lifespan in the atmosphere. But if it's just kind of that short-term guarantee, that may not be appropriate to offset carbon emissions, which have a lifespan of thousands of years in the atmosphere. So I think that's one thing that we haven't really grappled with at a policy level, is how we're considering that. You know, some people take a really hard line on this, and they say that we shouldn't be offsetting with nature-based solutions at all if we can't guarantee institutional longevity. Say if it's a university and they've planted trees and they've been around for 200 years, maybe they can guarantee it that they'll be around for a couple more 100 years and that those trees will be protected. And as Craig says, you know, it's absolutely not just trees. We've had an overemphasis on afforestation. Professor Natalie Seddon, who I work with, has written a brilliant paper on all of the other kind of types of brilliant nature that we can build on. But so maybe we need to think about institutional arrangements to ensure continual uptake of carbon from the atmosphere into nature. But also there's a lot of people who think that, you know, maybe we shouldn't be using nature to offset. And I'm not sure exactly where I land on this debate, because I think a lot of the voluntary offsets out there are really doing a lot more good than harm. And I would never want to sort of suck support from those programs. But maybe it's a short-term solution. Maybe in the long term, we'll be moving towards sort of more long-term removal and storage options. And I think, you know, the scientists in my program would slightly disagree with Craig to say that you know, nature is the machine and the machine that we need to be using to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. There's wide variation in the kind of global capacity for nature-based solutions. But the kind of estimates on average tend to be similar in magnitude to the amount of kind of CO2 that we're going to need to be dealing with simply due to system feedbacks as a result of climate change itself. So it may be that we need to restore nature to the best of our ability as a cushion for kind of the mess that we've already got ourselves into, which means that we may actually have to consider much more rapid reduction measures than we think. And we also maybe need to consider, I think, some CCS options, or at least investigating our ability to scale those options and testing them for safety and so forth. So those are some, I think, interesting debates in this conversation. Because we are Oxford Net Zero, and what we do is we sort of look at net zero targets globally, I wanted to give some figures. So at least 60% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world, whether that be in a corporate setting, a national setting, or a local or regional target, 60% of greenhouse gas emissions are covered by a net zero target. And that's 80% of GDP. And that's a new report coming out in actually 2 weeks. You're the first to hear it. But there's low standards across these net zero targets. And a lot of them are relying on nature-based solutions or saying that they will. And I'm worried about how many net zero targets are going to be relying on voluntary carbon market nature-based solutions, particularly those that are not of high quality. And so we really have a lot of work to do to be thinking about, if we are going to rely on those in the short term, how can we kind of scale that scale those solutions in ways that are principled. And I think we've mentioned biodiversity. Natalie Seddon has 4 principles for a good nature-based solution. So first, and I think Craig mentioned this, nature-based solutions are not a substitute for rapid cuts in fossil fuel emission. Second, all marine and terrestrial ecosystems are important for nature-based solutions. Third, Indigenous people and local communities must be the main stewards and beneficiaries of nature-based solutions. And 4, nature-based solutions must support biodiversity and ecosystem health. So I think those are really good high-level principles. Of course, it gets much more difficult after that to consider. And then I think the last point I'll leave you with is that there's a lot of talk about afforestation. I met at COP last year, actually. I had the pleasure of meeting a really lovely man named Bill Muma, who has developed a term called proforestation. And I think Craig spoke to this as well. So much of the rich potential of nature to suck up carbon is actually it's in soil, it's in biodiversity, it's in kind of the whole ecosystem. One tree is not kind of the goal. It's a whole ecosystem that we're trying to protect and restore. And so we need to be thinking about it like that rather than as sort of just a farm of trees that'll do the job. We need to be thinking about it as a whole ecosystem, the way I know that good farmers do.
Great, thank you, Kaya. A lot of excellent points there. It's, I think, a great segue into the discussion question and answer session. So I'd like to pick up, before we move to the audience questions, and ask one of my own, which is based on this balance between technological solutions and nature-based solutions, and get the view of the panel, whomever would like to jump in, on how we strike the right balance between things such as carbon capture and storage on the one hand and other technologies, and afforestation, rewilding, this sort of holistic ecosystem approach. So I just open that up.
Andrew, maybe I'll offer a thought on that. So the emphasis on the climate side over recent decades has been mostly technological. And you kind of see some of the analysis today, which tells us that nature-based solutions could be in the order of 1/3 of the solution to the climate change mitigation challenge, and yet is getting about 3% of the funding. So it's highly disproportionate at the moment. So if there was to be a change of emphasis, investing in the recovery of nature would seem to be a high priority for us now to put into the mix alongside technology. And the climate piece, it does hog the airtime and the attention. But bear in mind that, we're not only catching carbon through taking the nature-based solutions route. If we do it well, we're also contributing a big piece of adaptation and doing it in a cost-effective way. And we're also bringing other ecosystem services to boot. And so the recovery of peatlands, it's not only helping us to adapt to climate change and reducing flooding and catching carbon, it's also purifying the rivers, which is of benefit to the water industry and also to recreational fishing. And on top of that, you get all the biodiversity back too. So there are multiple wins embedded in the nature side beyond the carbon piece. And I do fear that, we've become slightly obsessed with carbon, which is why we finish up talking about tree planting, which for me, okay, it's like, it's easy to understand, but it's a bit too easy in some ways. And, we need to go beyond that and start to embrace some of the things that the other panel members have been talking about in how we go down this road.
Would anyone else like to jump in on that discussion?
I think Tony's absolutely right when he talks about a third. It is every third is really important. You have to focus on the whole package if you are going to do this. If you just focus on one part, and I would also share Tony's frustration, on focusing on carbon through the lens of trees. There are many other players in all of this as to how we can lock down more carbon into our soils. The importance of our grasslands for a start, the importance of more grass in our rotations, potentially much quicker results than planting trees, which I think takes 25 years to benefit from. So you've got to focus on what we believe are 3 pillars, which is ever smarter, climate smart farming effectively, and also the bioeconomy and renewable energy, and really drilling down into all three areas. Just prioritizing one means that we will never quite get there. So you've got to look at all three. And I think probably what is missing at the moment on our journey to 2040, 2050 is what are the package of measures that ultimately lower emissions? What is those package of measures and what do they look like? Because we need to start doing it now. So it's very easy to just focus on one bit. We've got to focus on the whole bit and all the measures. And Kaya's role in this, the work that Oxford are leading on is so incredibly important, and that is just moving at pace.
I mean, I just want to add that clearly in this is so important that we deliver on this challenge. We have to use what we know is going to work, really. And it is a very human thing to get excited about the brand new and the shiny and the clever bit of tech and so on. But there's a danger if we rely on technology that currently doesn't exist or might not emerge. I mean, for example, for the whole of my career, we've been promised that nuclear fusion is just a decade away. And it's always just a decade away. And just in the last year, yet again, we've seen lots more funding for nuclear fusion because apparently it's just a decade away. And that was the same 20 years ago. Whereas nature has been doing this job for free for us for hundreds of millions of years. So, you know, I think we need to have a lot more focus on the solutions that we know will work and can start immediately.
Greg, I couldn't agree with you more on the fairy tale of nuclear fusion. I had a friend at Oxford who was working on nuclear fusion, and I, over several late night arguments in the common room, got him to switch his entire career to fighting climate change, and that was probably my best achievement. And I agree with you. You know, I think this government in particular has focused far too much. I don't understand their focus on fusion at this point. I do, however, slightly disagree that carbon capture and storage is a fully fanciful idea. I think that, you know, while I completely agree that we need to be pumping as much resource as possible into nature, into restoring nature now, not to mention because of the co-benefits that Tony, and maybe they're not co-benefits, maybe they're primary benefits, right? Nature is good, it's good for us, we are part of nature. But I do think that carbon capture and storage may be an important piece of the solution, and we do actually have the infrastructure at scale. I mean, it's my personal view that it's fossil fuel companies should be sucking back as much carbon as they're selling to burn, and they have the infrastructure to do that. They have, you know, wells that they have left empty that, you know, that they could put the carbon back into. So I think that, you know, we need to be advancing solutions on all front. We can't really afford to be into ideological camps on anything, but I do believe that we're highly under investing in nature. And not everyone, also it's more democratic to focus on nature, right? Not everyone can be investing in large scale machine systems for carbon capture and storage.
Just to be clear, I didn't actually say CCS was fanciful, by the way, but. Sorry.
So I have a question coming in from the audience, and I would just remind the audience members you could submit those questions through Slido using the link below the video. We have a question from Adam Barnett of the RSPB, who asked, do the panelists recognize the potential of lowland peat as a nature-based solution? Innovative farming like polluted can be both profitable and sustainable. I know we've touched on this, but I'd like to hear more about this particular approach.
Yeah. Should I, Andrew? The lowland peat one is a big issue. And so that there has quite rightly been a very welcome focus on peatlands during recent years in relation to carbon emissions, amongst other things. But it seems, you know, quite a lot of the attention has been on upland peat, on blanket bogs, when in fact the bulk of the emissions in terms of CO2 is coming from lowland peat under agriculture. And this is very, very tricky because this is some of our most productive agricultural land. Huge proportion of our vegetables coming out of those landscapes. And we do need to be thinking carefully about how we can be slowing down and ultimately, hopefully, reversing emissions from those systems. There is a lowland agricultural peat task force which has been established as part of the peat strategy, which is beginning to look at this. But there's some quite challenging economics involved in there in terms of, the value of farmed produce compared to, a carbon price. Obviously, the livelihoods and businesses of the people who are working there and how they might be incentivized and helped to do something different. But one of the things that certainly is a very exciting theme is this question of paludiculture and how we might be using wetlands to be producing produce of different kinds. And there's a project that I know Craig knows very well called the Great Fen up the road here, and he might want to say more about it, but there's some paludiculture trials there in lowland peat in North Cambridgeshire, which are looking at food production and also the generation of fibre and also materials to be used in the production of organic insulation materials, which are being grown from plants in wetlands. And if you can get the management and the hydrology of that right, you might actually, over time begin to start accumulating plant remains again in those systems, thereby making it into a carbon sink rather than a source. But this is something that's very prominent on the Natural England agenda in terms of the peatland side, is to find ways of moving forward on the lowland part, as well as those challenging questions in the uplands.
Yeah, I mean, I just add to that, it is an incredibly important topic, and thank you for the question. As Tony was indicating, I think under some estimates, 20% of emissions from agriculture come from lowland peat soils. But of course, they're some of the most fertile areas, so they're very important for our food production. So we really need to be working together to try and find a solution to this. The project Tony was referring to, the Great Fen project, which you can find out a lot more online, has been undertaken by the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire with other partners. And it's doing exactly that. It's working with local farmers to try and find alternatives, so-called wet farming. And it's early days, but the results are looking very promising. And it's looking like, growing sphagnum moss for exactly the kind of uses that Tony was talking about there, and even experimenting with new varieties of plants and so on, does suggest that it could even be a more profitable agricultural future for farmers on there. So we need to work together on that, because at the moment, on average, we're losing around 2 centimetres of soil from our lowland fen soils every year, which is a lot of carbon, and it's just a lot of soil and fertility, with real questions about the long-term sustainability of that. So we know that this is a very important area, and it's just one where all the stakeholders need to be able to work together. But it does need to give, I think, a lot more attention from government in this area.
Well, that connects very well with a question from Jenny Merriman from WSP, who asks, how do we get stakeholders working together toward the same goals on nature, climate, and food in practice on the ground, and what is the key to making it work?
Okay, well, should I, Andrew? Well, one of the most exciting things going on at the moment, which is seeking an answer to that question, which is possibly the most important question of all, the response will in part be seen in this idea of local nature recovery strategies, which will come through in the Environment Bill. And this will be a county level process in England that will seek to bring people together to effectively do some outline spatial planning as to where at county level, and Natural England will have a role both at that level and also connecting counties, to try and get some broad view of where it would be sensible to be doing nature recovery. And once we've got that sense of priority in different landscapes, more fen here, more heathland there, more woodland somewhere else, probably avoiding the best agricultural land in order to be able to do nature recovery in ways which are going to be impacting least on food production, to be able to come up with that spatial initial thinking, and then to be deploying all of the different tools we've got to be able to make that happen. So we've got biodiversity net gain coming through in the Environment Bill. We've got a tree strategy in development. We've got a peat strategy. We've got the elm agricultural policy, of course. If you could combine all of those different strands of money and policy alongside the work of farmers, alongside the work of water companies, alongside the work of the NGOs, you could in landscapes start to put together a jigsaw, not only of ecosystems being restored, but also the people who are going to do it, and also the funding streams that would enable them to do it. And so that joining up, that weaving together of the ecological picture, the policy picture, and the human picture that is possibly the most important thing we have to do on this at the moment, because there's loads of good stuff going on, a little project here, a little project there. They're very positive, but in the end, they don't add up to what we need, which is large scale reconnection of nature and the rebuilding of natural infrastructure in a way which makes ecological sense, rather than just in terms of, you know, particular projects in particular places, even though they might be very good. So that's work in progress, and the Environment Bill hopefully will be delivering that new tool fairly soon. And then certainly at Natural England, we're very much looking forward to working with everybody in making the most of that.
I think Kaya is excited about the research potential of studying those sorts of strategies. But I was wanting to get Minette's view on how farmers and agriculture would play a role in shaping stakeholder engagement around these sorts of solutions.
I think it's essential, Andrew, that the challenge within the rural economy at the moment is that the farmer voice is a small voice, effectively, and yet it underpins 70% of the country. So how do we reverse the conversation, and how do we have farmers as a solution, and how do we attract people from all walks of life, wherever they live in the country, into the jobs that I believe are going to be associated with the growth of the green economy going forward? And that needs national leadership. Now, what Tony is talking about is fine and all well and good, but what I believe we need now is a clear focus on those national policies of how we are going to lower our emissions, how we are going to get to net zero, and what that is going to look like. Now, for this sector, for 70% of the country, it is exciting in that it is a source and it is a sink. And there are a whole raft of different things that need to be done in order to get there. But we cannot do it without the farmers involved. And then, of course, you look upstream in the supply chain and you realize that you have to agree what I talked about at the beginning with those principles. Otherwise, other people will go off at their own pace. And we have to be able to produce our food, do more for the environment, get to carbon neutral, and we have to do it all together as one. So I don't agree with leaving places for agriculture and saying this is where we're going to grow our food. You know, this country has huge diversity of what it can produce and where it can produce. And some parts are better than other parts. We're not going to be growing broccoli and lettuce in the uplands, but we can be doing more for the environment and grazing sheep in different places in the uplands and cattle. So it's horses for courses, effectively, on where we do this in the country, but farmers have to be at the heart of it. And we've ripped up all the old rule books. So we have a new opportunity to create a new policy for what this is going to look like. And that is where the global opportunity comes in. You look at the scientific capability, which finally, thank goodness, has risen to the fore due to COVID and the vaccination and what Oxford has achieved. But this is what we need to do at a global scale now, and really work up those science and evidence for what is going to underpin sustainable farming, sustainable food going forwards, and sustainable living as well, because you can't have, everybody has got to be involved in this. It's not just about farmers versus consumers. Everyone has got to be involved, but you've got to start with the farmer. If you leave them out, you can achieve none of it.
Minette, if I may, we have a question from the audience from Jake Fens, who asks, multifunctioning ecosystems capture carbon better than anything else, which we've also acknowledged the broader ecosystem benefits of kind of restoration. But how would you say farming can deliver kind of those complex multifunctioning ecosystems, given the current model that it's been following?
Oh, it can't, given the current model it's been following. I mean, that's the whole point. You know, the CAP, whatever you thought about remain or leave, you know, it ended up being about farming entitlements and not about farming. The future has to be about farming and getting into the soil, getting into the core business of how we produce our food and how we set aside on the back of more effective farming businesses, we set aside more land for nature, and we deal with the biodiversity, which will be a natural evolution if we get the farming bit right. But this has to be the focus of the future policy. If you invest and get the right policy incentives for food production, then you will have major, major benefits for nature, for wildlife, for biodiversity, and getting to that journey of net zero, which I believe is a very exciting journey, because if we can produce these things on the earth, that is the game changer. And the points that Tony made and Craig made around lowland peat, you know, that is a massive opportunity. But we've got to look at this in the round, and we've got to look at the whole package. I think that's the important thing. And what we need to know now is what those incentives are, what the policy looks like.
Minette, I think Kaya has a question for you, actually. What is your stance on, wait, it disappeared. Would you like to ask it, Kaya?
Yeah, I was just going to ask what your position, because I'm just learning about this now. What's your position on cover crop no-till farming? It's been posited by some recent documentaries as like the answer.
Yeah, look, it has a real place. The more you can have cover crops, things growing in soil that stop soil erosion, the better, and put down more nitrogen, natural nitrogen into the soil, the better. Where I think it goes wrong is there is not a one size fits all, Kaya, and it's very easy to get evangelical and think that everybody can be about regenerative agriculture. Everybody can't be about regenerative agriculture. Some places can. We can get to a no-tillage system in parts of the country. We can't in others. Growing fruit and vegetables, which we need to grow far more of here, that is difficult in a regenerative system. So it is about different things, different measures, but it's your area of expertise, if you like, that is going to provide the seismic changes for how we produce going forwards in the future. And it's quite easy to get sucked into what I would call a sort of evangelical approach. It's different approaches depending on the land that you are farming in this country.
So we have some great questions coming in from the audience. I would just remind that you can add them through Slido using the link underneath the video. But if we zoom out a little bit and we think about COP and the sort of global scale of this question, we have a question from Sophie Myries, who says, we need land for crops, or we will need to get them shipped from other countries, and that will involve more CO2. But we also need the land for biodiversity net gain. So how do we balance these two issues? Whomever would like to jump in.
Well, I mean, one thing that I think is, evidently something of a gap at the moment is the extent to which, there is a joined up land use policy across the country. And the country needs to do a lot of things at once. It needs to produce food, secure clean water, have room for housing, have room for industry, accommodate infrastructure, needs to catch carbon from the atmosphere, needs to conserve biodiversity, and have places for everybody to enjoy themselves. And, we've got quite a small country with quite a lot of people in it. And I think, having a slightly more integrated view of how we accommodate all of these things, because they're all essential. And what we've historically had, I think, is often, a series of binary arguments. Is food more important than nature? Is the green belt more important than housing? Is travel more important than the new railway? Travel and a new railway more important than nature? And we kind of go round in circles without having, a very clear view of what the good outcome looks like. So, having said that, and, highlighting what I would regard as something of a gap in terms of an overall vision for land use, that question about is it food or is it biodiversity, you just bear in mind that the food growing is just one element of it, and like every other country in the world, we've got an issue with food waste, which is basically a land waste, is the other way you might look at that. And also, we've got issues of diet and the extent to which, in some parts of the world, people aren't hungry anymore. If anything, we've got a crisis in health from overnutrition. And so there's a broader picture there too, in terms of the food system, as well as how we look at land use. But it's an incredibly important question. and one that hopefully starts to provoke some integrated outcomes. But one thing I would say that is definitely progress over the last few years, and Minette is exemplifying it today very well, is the extent to which the conversation has moved beyond, is it food or farming? Is it food and farming or nature, into a much more productive discussion we're having now about how we do both, because both are essential. And so, you know, at least we've made that step, which is a very significant one, and which is very much laying the grounds now for some much better outcomes, I would say.
Kaya, would you like to weigh in on this question at all? Haven't heard from you for a moment.
No, I don't think I can contribute much to this question. I think it's one of the most difficult public planning challenges there is, but I completely agree that the better coordination, you know, and I think examples like earlier around like how do you use space that is seemingly negative space, like the sort of space between rows, hedgerows, that helps contribute to biodiversity net gain. We have a kind of team in Oxford that's just looking at biodiversity and carbon uptake potential of local farms around Oxford. And there was 160 rows on this spreadsheet of tiny things that the kind of farmers could do that could increase biodiversity. Stuff you'd never think about, thinking about just where hedgehogs might go if you create little homes. You can create homes for nature to fill spaces that you didn't even think were proper spaces because we don't think of using them. And I think that is the beautiful creativity of this problem that we have to address.
I'll just chime in on this. I mean, other panelists have sort of said it, but I think sometimes we still sort of hear this kind of binary debate in some quarters. I mean, not from Minette and not from others on the panel. And sometimes there's this suggestion that we might almost sacrifice some bits of the world for just very intensive food production and other bits just for nature. And I think that would be the wrong way to go. I think actually what is much more sustainable is if the more that we can integrate the two. Of course, inevitably, you're going to have some areas that are more intensive agriculture, and you're going to have some areas that are there principally for biodiversity, and particularly coming back to Jake's question about multifunctional ecosystems. You know, we need some of those core multifunctional ecosystems somewhere, and some places in the UK which could be properly wild. But actually, for the vast majority of our land, it is about how we can make sure that this works alongside each other much better. And say at the Wildlife Trust, we have several farms of our own where we practice nature-friendly farming, and we experiment and demonstrate approaches to nature-friendly farming. We have a partnership with Jordan's Ryvita around giving advice on their farms, where actually we now have around 17% of those farm land is set aside for nature, and that's a very profitable company, of course, producing cereals grown here in the UK to British consumers. So I think there are ways forward here, but it just comes back to that question before. It's about how stakeholders work together. And if we have shared outcomes, you know, we might sometimes disagree on details. Minette and I sometimes disagree on details and quibble about certain areas, but I think we have shared outcomes of where we want to get to ultimately, and I think that's how you can work in partnership.
Definitely. Excellent. So again, kind of zooming out just a little bit, if we think about the nature-based solutions we've discussed, all wonderful, and we think about scaling them globally and regionally as well, how can we, this is a question from an anonymous participant, how can assurances be provided that environmental and social outcomes are being delivered? And I would add on to that, how can we ensure the longevity of those outcomes into the future?
Andy, can I just jump in there? Because
Sure.
This is the point that I made about it being verifiable. It's absolutely essential that it is verifiable. Otherwise, it just becomes greenwash. And I think it was Kaya or maybe Craig that made this point in the beginning. You know, this is not easy. This is difficult. This will require public and private investment, and it really will need everybody to work together, both in the public and the private sector. Otherwise, we will just simply not get to where we need to get to. But I think if I could say one point on this question, it is about that verifiable route. Because if you can't verify it, ultimately it's words and it's meaningless. And
Yeah.
we're seeing more and more people use what I would just say is greenwash. It's warm words and it means nothing.
Yeah.
So the customer wants to know, you know, effectively what it says on the tin is in the tin, and they are expecting it, they are demanding it. And so we are going to be able to have to give that assurance. And you're already seeing other countries. I mean, New Zealand is quite interesting to look at what they are doing. They're already building in their methane accounting into brand New Zealand. There is a real opportunity, and Craig and I have discussed this before, about brand Britain. We cannot just live wrapped in the Union Jack. You know, we have to live on our values, on our credentials, and that is about that verifiable route to what assurance is. And for agriculture, that's great, because that's about the food that we eat, essentially about the fibers that we use, both, you know, and the green energy effectively as well. So you've got many different components in all of this, but you've got to be able to verify it back to the production level through that whole chain, wherever you're coming from.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, that part about having confidence, is the carbon being captured, is it going to stay there? And having some scheme or some system of being able to provide confidence for investors, it's essential. We're never going to get a carbon offset market if people don't know they're getting any carbon. I mean, it's kind of, it's basic. And one would expect there'd be a role for official bodies there to be able to make sure that that work is done in a credible and reliable way. I was having a chat actually with a colleague in the US a few days ago who has been working in the US financial system to be able to create green mortgages for people to be able to differentiate between houses that, you know, have invested in energy efficiency and those that haven't. And the only reason that works is because of verification from the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. And so that piece of credibility and expert oversight that comes from an official body that's been charged with doing the number crunching and the measurement, it's made a whole new mechanism work for not much cost, but it required somebody to do it who could stand back with the tools and the capability to be able to give that assurance.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think verification, if we can crack that in the next few years, that would be one of the most important sensitive intervention points that we could make. And, you know, and it especially at a global scale, right? I was working with young sharecrop farmers in Africa on a panel we did for the kind of Race to Zero COP26 team, and they were talking about how there's just no jobs, and there's, you know, people are leaving farming, and those that have farmed are, you know, don't have any kind of incentive to use regenerative practices. But if we could get kind of a verification system down at scale, then we might create sort of new markets in places that have desperate poverty, and that could be really good on multiple levels. There's lots of things kind of being explored right now on verification. You know, how can we use satellite imagery? But I have a lot of questions as to kind of, and I'm sure Minette is nodding, there's a lot of questions as to like how you can possibly use satellite imagery to tell whether or not, you know, soil is in good health. And it just means that we may need to have a much wider kind of public sector, private sector, NGO industry working on this together. And I think if we can get verification down, that would be huge.
Craig, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the only point I would sort of add to it, because I very much agree with what everyone's been saying, but I would also add that maybe just as a counter, without disagreeing to what's being said, we've also got to be careful that we don't focus just on those things that come first of mind for measurement and that are relatively easy to measure. I mean, just in the world of sort of nature, if you like, and biodiversity, it's interesting how we used to focus very much on just the extent of habitat, you know, how much habitat there was, and whether species were present or absent, extinct or not, because that was relatively easy to measure. I think in more recent years, we've come to realise just how important measuring abundance is, so the abundance of species population as well, how many of them there are. And all that points actually to the real holy grail, which is ecosystem function and ecosystem services. How do we measure those? And ultimately, that's what's really important. Essentially, is nature working for us or not? And sometimes that's a bit harder to measure, or historically it has been, for the reasons Kaya says it's getting easier. But actually, sometimes thinking about how we evolve these and don't just measure the things that's easiest to measure is also really important. But I mean, I still agree with what everyone said.
Excellent. So we have another question from an anonymous participant. I would just add that the audience can submit more questions. We've had some excellent ones, so it would be great to have a few more using the Slido link. But our anonymous participant has asked, surely the richest country should directly financially assist less wealthy countries to abandon negative policies. How would we achieve this at COP? How can it be done?
So, well, this country has had a big emphasis on, its international climate finance stream, and been doing good work, including in relation to deforestation and the nature side. I would, however, suggest that it would be positive to insert a narrative of self-interest into this for those countries that are not as developed as the UK. That goes back to my opening remarks about national self-interest. And, for Brazil, yes, does it need international finance to help it get beyond deforestation? Well, yes, it might do. But at the same time, it's got its own economic reasons for not continuing with deforestation that, it might be good to emphasize as well. And one country that I think stands head and shoulders above the others in the developing world in exemplifying this point is Costa Rica, which in the mid-1980s decided for economic and self-centered economic reasons that actually deforestation was a very bad idea. And to cut a long story short, between the mid-1980s and now, that country has doubled its forest cover at the same time as doubling its per capita GDP. And they did that through a strategy which was about conserving and restoring forests in order to get secure water, which was essential for the cities and also for hydroelectricity, and also was in anticipation of an ecotourism market, which that country now has excelled in. It's getting an awful lot of money coming in there because people come to look at the macaws and the tapirs and the sloth because they haven't killed them all and the forest is still there. And it's an enormously important part of the economy. And I think many developing countries, in getting off the old treadmill of traditional economic development and into this kind of discussion we're having today about how nature and low carbon can be harnessed for nationally important economic and social outcomes, that is a very important line of questioning and discussion to have alongside the international development finance side of it, which hopefully can help countries go down that route. But it's more than that. I think, it's very important for countries to see that their own destiny is better served by them investing in nature recovery, and other countries can help with that. But I wouldn't see it solely as a question of transfers from rich to poor, which has been a very dominant part of these discussions for nearly 30 years, and quite rightly to some extent, but it's bigger than that.
Minette, do you want to weigh in on that? And I would just add on to that. I mean, in terms of free trade agreements and other international sort of agreements, right? How would you see working in sort of biodiversity and nature-based solutions into the relations between developing and developed countries?
Well, on that point, Andrew, and that is a massive challenge. But the two sort of I guess beacons of light are Biden coming in the US and China now entering into this discussion, which it never has done, and those potentially are big global movers in this area. But we've got a really long way to go with influencing global trade, and particularly how we trade agricultural commodities, whereby we have been driving price ever downwards, and it's going to be very difficult to turn that ship around. It really, really is. And until we do that, I don't believe we're going to change many other things. So there really has to be a will to do that. And I would, or am in danger of sounding like a broken record on the voice of farmers here, because we are part of the World Farmers Organization. And through that lobby, finally, farmers are recognized at the Paris Accord. And also at the FAO on the World Food Security Committee, they now have representation. So we had a World Food Security Committee with no farmer representation on it.
Oh, wow.
And therein lies one of the massive challenges of our time, that big corporate entities have driven this agenda to a certain extent. And the people, the communities across the world that are reliant on agriculture to keep them in these very, very rural food producing places, there's only a small proportion of the world that we can produce our food on. they have not been at the party, so their voices have not been heard. So that is, I believe, what needs to change, and that is not difficult too, because I have sat in rooms with African subsistence farmers and the US as an example, and it's not easy, but that's the only way we're going to do what needs to be done. And there is a lot of optimism out there, because we've got, you know, if you've got a phone, you've got technology, and as long as you've got electricity and you've got access to technology, then you can start to drive change. And I've seen, as a trustee of Farm Africa, which I am, how you can drive massive change, and you can bring then, I'm not going to say wealth, but you can bring prosperity to communities, because they can trade, they can build businesses, and then they can build clean water infrastructure, they can build better education facilities, they can really change lives. But it has to start with the basics, it has to start with the farmer. So it's another shout out to say that we have to have farmers involved in all of these discussions globally.
Okay. And then Kaya.
Yeah, well, I mean, the question was about whether we, as rich countries, need to help other countries abandon policies that go in the wrong direction, or systems in the wrong direction. I mean, yes, there is a role for that, but we also need to look at sometimes the conditions and the infrastructure that we put in place that sometimes then encourages other countries to put these dodgy policies in place. And actually, trade is a classic one. You know, how often have we been party as the UK to trade deals that has actually fueled a lot of these bad practices around the world? And I think we need to be thinking very carefully about how we make sure that when we try and negotiate trade deals in the future, it's almost like a race to the top in terms of our production standards, rather than a race to the bottom. Minette and I have agreed before in the past about how we have to make sure that we cannot have food imports to this country that are made to lower quality standard than is being produced by British farmers. And it's really sad how the default position in trade deals is to kind of eradicate standards rather than to try and have standards that prop up a healthy environment and a healthy income for farmers. Another point I'd make, though, is we're talking about sort of other countries, but something we've not talked about yet is also the wider oceans. And that is such an important part of this wider story about nature-based solutions. It's estimated that oceans annually absorb around 20 to 35% of human-made CO2 emissions. And yet, sadly, our oceans are in a very bad state. There's massive problems with overfishing right around the world. Again, really, that's caused by big corporate entities much more than it is small local fisher folk and fishing communities. And here in the UK, of course, we've seen a lot of our fisheries overfished. It's hard for many people to imagine that just 400, 500 years ago, you'd be able to pop out into the North Sea and see cod that grew up to 3 meters long. And it would be described that the North Sea would be boiling with fish, and the Irish Sea too. It's not like that now. So if we can put the measures in place to restore the abundance of in our oceans, and to improve the ecosystem health in our oceans and stop overfishing, that is going to be a critical part for providing nature-based solutions as well.
Kai, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and that's such a poignant image, Craig. So one of the things that Oxford has been thinking about lately is a way that, you know, if countries are going to set net zero targets, they really need to align all of the rest of their agencies, department, and policies along with that goal. And that goes for biodiversity net gain as well. And so, you know, one way you could do that is conditional bailouts on heavy emitting industries. And let's just be clear with the kind of conversations around developed, you know, countries that are kind of rising up. Just the footprint of a single person in this country is just so many times larger than a footprint of a person in another country. And so while I absolutely believe that we can help those other countries leapfrog, I think we need to be clear too about where a huge amount of the emissions reduction cuts have to come from. But I think in terms of so the idea around conditional bailouts so that all kind of net zero, all industries that are getting money for ongoing recovery spending, they should be aligned with a robust net zero strategy. If the UK is going to give them money, that's kind of a good perspective if the UK has a net zero goal. But the same could go for development aid funding from the government. You know, we have people submitting applications to go do consulting work in countries where the UK and other countries give foreign aid, and they're not necessarily doing full impact reviews as to sort of whether the projects that they're working on are going to be in line with that nation's net zero target, or our net zero target, or our kind of nature goals, or their nature goals. And there are some kind of impact assessments that you can do, and the World Bank has a few, but I think that we have a lot of work to do to make sure that the kind of applications to the type of advice that consulting firms are giving through sort of our foreign aid process are in line with our goals and values.
Definitely. So we're reaching the end of the session, but I do want to ask one question submitted to us from Neil Harwood. And I think it touches on some of the issues of surrounding a green recovery and moving beyond the pandemic. So we're seeing more and more in the media about species linked to pandemics and zoonotic diseases, right? How much can that be legitimately used as a trigger to encourage large-scale nature-based solutions discussions and conservation more generally?
Well, if it's not used as a trigger, it will be a great tragedy. If you look at the economic harm that's been caused by this pandemic, I heard one figure today that the cost so far of the pandemic globally is about $23 trillion. And, you know, if this is traced back ultimately to elements of the wildlife trade, then one would expect that some quite searching questions will be asked in the future about how we can foster more international cooperation to end certainly the illegal wildlife trade and begin to be putting in place safeguards to protect against this kind of thing happening in the future. You know, Ebola in Africa appears to have been linked with deforestation, bringing people into closer contact with zoonotic sources of disease. Nipah virus, which is a deadly pathogen which broke out in Malaysia some years ago, again linked with deforestation. HIV/AIDS came from the bushmeat trade and people hunting apes and monkeys. SARS in 2003, 2004, civet cats being kept in restaurants and transmitting disease to people. And then even during the pandemic going on now, last year, there were a couple of outbreaks of potentially really very dangerous influenza in chicken and pig farms in China. And so you start putting all of that together and look at the risk that is fostered through that kind of relationship with the natural world. And you'd ask yourself, why wouldn't the world in the wake of this now pay very serious attention to joining up this question of nature and nature recovery and the biodiversity agenda that's coming through in Kunming and the nature-based solutions piece that we're talking about now in relation to climate change? It all comes together. And if this isn't a springboard for nature recovery and changing our relationship with nature, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I'm going to get a book to show you. This was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was, strange enough, published around the time of the millennium. Strange that, 20 years ago by the United Nations. And that was the first document where I was made aware of the risk that fragmenting wildlife habitats, particularly in the tropics, could cause to zoonotic diseases, escape of zoonotic diseases. And it warned in that document 20 years ago that if we continue to fragment those wildlife habitats, the frequency of possible pandemics was going to increase. And just as Tony said, we've seen that happening over the last 2 decades, and yet we haven't heeded those warnings. So the first thing to bear in mind here, it's true with climate, it's true with biodiversity loss and so on. Unfortunately, globally as a society, we've not been good enough at listening to the scientists that have been warning us of these problems for years to come. The second thing to think about is, my goodness, the technological response to this has been phenomenal with the development of those vaccines, and it's been absolutely fantastic. Of course, thank goodness for those vaccines, but it would be entirely wrong if we thought that was just the answer to this. Actually, we are, with the vaccines, if you like, we're treating the symptoms of this pandemic rather than the root causes. And so what we have to do is put nature into recovery globally and change our relationship with nature if we're going to stop new pandemics emerging. And I'll give you this sobering thought. As of today, almost a year on from lockdown first being announced in this country, actually we've made it more likely rather than less likely in the last year that the next pandemic will emerge. because over the last year we've continued to fragment wildlife habitats, particularly in the tropics, rather than slow it down or put into recovery. We've made the situation it more likely the next pandemic happens, not less likely. So we've got to learn lessons from this, proper deep lessons, and turn this around.
Come in, Andrew.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, you know, what most people will relate to as a zoonosis is probably BCG and tuberculosis. It's a disease that ultimately can transition from animals to people, has a wildlife vector. Obviously, in this situation, you know, you have a situation with badgers, with people, with cattle. And the BCG vaccine is still the only vaccine that can deal with it. And there is, through international law, a requirement that governments have to deal with zoonosis. They have a legally binding responsibility, if you look at the OIE, in order to make sure that they deal with them. So they are very, very complex zoonosis, that they can jump, they can mutate, and they remain a massive threat. And this one has done what nothing else managed to do, and to jump, and we still don't know the extent of the new strains and what we're facing. So it's got to provide a marker for change, because we have to change. And I think, you know, there will be and has to be positive legacy on the back of all of this. But a lot of it is down to our relationship with nature. Our relationship with food, though, is at the heart of all of this. And the more we continue to take our food system for granted, we will continue with this challenge. And I am amazed. I'm one of those sad people that goes into a supermarket and stands there in awe in the doorway at what has been achieved. But I'm probably the only person that does that. And we take it for granted. And until we start to take food and value food more, things will not change. So that's what every single person has to remember, and governments above all else have to remember.
Yeah.
Maya, would you like to add to that as well?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about my next visit to the grocery store and the awe that I'm going to bring. The person at the door is going to be like, are you going to use the pump thing, or are you going to move on? I have to echo, this has been such a lovely panel, and I couldn't agree more on this point. There was an incredible piece that came out in the New York Times in July, which was, I think, timely, called The Ecology of Disease. And I think disease specialists, I know a few at Oxford working on the vaccine, they're notoriously careful about what they will say. They do not overstretch. They never say sort of more than what is precisely what they believe to be true, because people's lives are on their hands. If, you know, their science has to be precise. And these are a bunch of disease specialists saying that absolutely, if we do not fix our relationship with nature, if we do not see ourselves as inextricably linked to our ecosystem and animals and plants ecosystems, it's just we don't have kind of a way out of this. And so yeah, I encourage you, I'll pop it in the chat, The Ecology of Disease. I'm sure there's much more kind of scientific stuff to look at, but it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for the excellent contributions to this discussion, and to thank the audience as well for your participation and the wonderful questions. This will bring to a close Bright Blue's first event in our Looking Ahead to COP series, but we have several more planned for the coming months leading up to the conference, in partnership with the John Ellerman Foundation. So thank you so much for your time, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, as well as our speakers as well. And until next time, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.